Pause. Oh, it is recording. Presumably to the cloud, I hope. It didn't ask me usually. I don't know what happened. Anyway, yeah, well, let me start introducing Maurice in just in case no one else, although I do expect a few more students. They should be here. Yeah, Maurice does some amazing work on AI and biases and all sorts of things. I had a look, and I had trouble tearing myself loose from his homepage because I wanted to read everything that's there. So, and I also I learned where Bauhaus University is. I had no idea. It's in Weimar. And I don't know why it's called Bauhaus. I mean, there's lots of other famous people in Weimar. So, but anyway, it's wonderful to have him here. And I think I'll just give you the floor and take it from here. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Steve. I'm gonna test my setup with Zoom and the presentation. How much time do I have, roughly?
I mean, 40 minutes plus questions, 45.
Okay, sounds
or
good.
Shorter, up to you,
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Do you guys see my slides? Yes. All right. So yeah, thanks again for the intro. It's very nice to be here. I'm actually on my wrong slide, so let's just go back to the beginning. Yeah, and I've also prepped a few notes on what I'm doing, but just to extend on what Steve has already introduced here, I'm Maurice Jakesch, finished my PhD at Cornell in information science, and I'm now building a new lab for computational social science at Bauhaus University. What we do here is we combine social science theories, approaches with digital experiments, machine learning prototypes, and data science to study the impact that digital technology has on our society. And so I'm quite excited to get to know you all doing quite related work. What I want to talk about today is a work line of us that demonstrates that the recent advances that we're seeing in language technologies and AI may not only enable new and faster communication, but may give rise to new forms of persuasion that our democratic institutions might struggle with. In my talk today, I want to ask the question how we can push the boundaries of current behavioral research. And I'm going to begin this talk by introducing one of our studies on how interacting with large language models affects people's views. Then I'll use that study to highlight the limitations of our current empirical work. And I want to consider different strategies for extending the conclusions of empirical research into impact forecasting. So in this first part of my talk, I'll present a study that we did some time ago to measure whether AI writing assistants affect people's opinions. Our study here was motivated by the concerns that I just laid out. In particular, we were concerned that if we deeply embed large language models into people's daily communication, new forms of persuasion might emerge. What do I mean by new forms of persuasion? So in conventional persuasion, we have a persuader who designs a message that is then sent to people to influence them. And technology also influences behavior through targeted choice architecture that have been conceptualized as nudges. What we do here is we take this critical insight of nudge theory that setting up choice defaults affects what people do, and we apply it to the uses of large language models in communication. And here, by making it easier to say certain things, but not others, large language models may change what is being said, and they may change the attitudes of the users of these models, and indirectly, even of those who read what users are writing. So to test how language models affect people's opinions, we needed an environment where we could watch people interact with large language models in the process of articulating their own opinion. and where we had some control over the language model's views. So we developed this web app for the study where we could do exactly that. We needed a scenario here or a task that we could observe people in, and we decided to have people write on whether social media is good for society or not. Now, our study isn't about this topic specifically, but we chose it because it is an accessible topic that is relevant to people at a personal and societal level, and they have different views on it. We then took that topic and built it into a social media mockup that made the setting more realistic. Next, we needed an opinionated language model. We started with GPT-3, which in its pre-trained form seemed to talk about social media in a positive way. But for our design, what we wanted was experimental control over what the model said, over the model opinion, so to say. And we used prompt engineering to steer the model in the direction that we wanted. This is how we did it. Imagine a participant was writing a sentence and we would ask the model to continue it. But we wouldn't just ask the model to continue it, but insert instructions before the user's writing, telling the model to argue for a certain opinion. And in many cases, this would work out and the model would start suggesting text that was in line with the opinion that we engineered into it. We then took this web app from the previous slide and built a writing assistant into it, which connected to this opinionated language model in the backend. So here's a quick demo. On the top, you see instructions for participants. Center of the page, our mock-up of the Reddit discussion, where a user is asking others about their opinion on social media, followed by a reply field where participants type their opinion. The assistant in this demo is configured to suggest continuations when users stop typing and to argue that social media is bad for society. So let's try this. Now, once I stop typing, the system generates suggestions, and as intended, these suggestions argue that social media is bad. But let's see what happens when I start typing something that argues social media is good for society. So we see the model will still try to continue the flow of writing, but at the same time, it will try to be in line with the opinion that we have engineered it towards. And so the question here is, what effect will that have on what people write and also what they think afterwards? We recruited 1,500 participants from Prolific to explore this, and we asked them to respond to this Reddit post. We ran a basic between groups experimental design here, where 500 of those participants didn't see any suggestions in the control group. We had 500 people seeing suggestions from a model arguing that social media is good, and 500 writing with a model that was engineered to argue social media is bad. After participants wrote their social media posts, we made them complete a survey on their attitudes towards social media, and we asked a separate set of 500 crowd workers to evaluate each sentence that participants had written and to label whether it argued that social media was good or bad. I see there's a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you prefer to take questions along the way or at the end or whatever.
I can take them along the way.
Okay. This is just the beginning of a very promising setup, and I'm wondering if you looked at how people, other participants, think about the words. Like, do they think that it are these their own thoughts? Like, do they think that eventually what's written down, it's their own words and thoughts, or do they ascribe it to the language model?
Mm-hmm. So we didn't quite do that in this study, but there's related work from Jeff Hancock and Hannah at Stanford, and they've looked at ownership and agency.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're finding is sort of a mix. So like people still tend to feel ownership over the process. And it kind of depends on like how this is set up and like what they're doing, how much ownership they feel, but it doesn't feel like this is a foreign output to them. What we are seeing in this study, again, without explicitly looking at ownership, is that people tend to interact with that thing in a way that feels more like interactive, where they like we did interviews with like 15, 20 participants after the process and showed them a replay of the thing and asked them, okay, so why did you do this? Like talk me through your process. Like, why did you accept this and why not? And what they told us is they're not concerned about this process because they're always in control. Like there's no point at which they're being forced to do anything. There's no point at which they're losing control over their writing process. And so it still feels like they are the one calling the shots and they are the one deciding over the final product. They also say things like, I can always take it back. So like even if they're quickly accepting something without being too thoughtful, they think they can always go back and change it. But they don't really notice like how much of their agency is slipping away in that process. And I think that's one thing that we want to highlight in our work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, so we had this experimental design, and yeah, in the next step, I'm going to introduce our results. The first thing that we looked at was the opinion participants had expressed in this social media post they wrote. So if you recall, we had like 500 crowd workers labeling each sentence in their social media post, like everything that they have written, and indicating what opinion it argued for. And this graph shows the aggregate opinions in participants writing. On the top, we have participants writing with a model that argues social media is good. Center, participants who didn't see any model suggestions. And on the bottom, participants who were assisted by a model configured to argue social media is bad. Now on the x-axis, we see what percentages of participant sentences expressed which opinion. And we see that in the control group where participants wrote, right, here we are. We see that in a control group where participants wrote without an AI, 36% of their sentences would argue that social media is bad for society, shown in blue in the center. In orange, we see that in the same group, 28% of sentences argued social media is good for society, so participants were slightly more critical of social media in the control. Now in the top row, where participants used the model arguing that social media is good for society, that has changed. Here we have 25% of participants' sentences arguing social media is bad for society and 45% of their sentences arguing that social media is good for society. We see the opposite result in the treatment group on the bottom, where participants wrote with a model arguing that social media is bad. So what we know from this is that when people write with an opinionated language model, that changes the opinions that participants express in their writing and social media posts. Things messed up here. Okay. Well, there could be different reasons for that. And one could be people just find it more convenient to go with the model suggestions. And another reason could be that people actually had their views changed by the model. And that's something we wanted to explore. We explored that by looking at the results in the survey participants completed after the task to see if there's any difference in post-task opinion. And in this graph, I show the responses that people gave when asked, would you say social media is good for society in the survey after writing? And when they had used a model that argued social media is good for society, 45% of them said yes, compared to 25% who said yes when they wrote with a model arguing that social media is bad for society. In both cases, participants' attitudes differed significantly from those in the control group who didn't see any suggestions in their writing. So we now know that not only did the opinionated model change what participants wrote, but it also changed what participants thought to a point where even after finishing the writing, they were still affected by the model's opinion. Now, having found that the opinionated model affects both what people express in writing and their opinions in a later attitude survey, we wondered whether people were aware of this influence. So we asked them after the writing process whether they thought that the model was opinionated. And it turns out that most participants had not even noticed that a language model was biased, even though we had made the model pretty strongly opinionated. In particular, shown in the top row, when the model supported participants' own opinion, only 10% of them thought the model was not balanced or reasonable, shown in blue in the top row. In the bottom, even when the model went against participants' own opinion, pretty much most of the time, so most of their writing, the suggestions would try to argue against them. Only 30% of participants said, yes, the model's suggestions were unbalanced. We also found that the participants largely believed that the model did not affect their opinion. And these secondary findings show that not only are people affected by the model's opinion, but they mostly do not even notice when a model is opinionated and influences them. We ran a larger replication study, testing a similar experiment on a wider set of topics. So here we included also more contentious issues like death penalties, standardized testing, and we're trying to get a sense of whether what we're observing in this smaller initial scenario is something that generalizes to a wider set of topics and also social media settings. And we found that I think on all of our topics, we saw an effect here, with the exception of actually death penalty, where we only saw an effect on one of our outcomes. Yeah, no, we saw a between group effect here, but we also measured within group, like within participant effects. So for this study, what we did is we asked people like a few weeks before taking the survey about their opinion. And then when we recruited them, we compared their post-task opinion not between groups, but to their opinion that they had indicated sometime earlier. And we also found that there was an effect here, both between groups and within participants, except that the within participant effect didn't show for the death penalty. We added a couple of other treatments to explore what's happening here, where we compared the influence effect of the AI assistant to just showing static text. And we're finding something where what we are interpreting into this is that the influence effect of this AI writing assistant is actually stronger than just showing static text to people. We also explored whether we could try to mitigate the effect by warning people about the language model's bias. And we're finding that the effect still persists, even if we tell people before that the language models are biased and might influence them. We also found that if we tell them afterwards, like after writing, but before doing the post-task survey, that the model was biased and might have influenced them, they're still influenced by the model's opinion. There are a couple of other interesting studies in the field that seem to align with our work and with that direction. LLMs can apparently generate compelling propaganda and disinformation. They can draft public communication as effective as those from government agencies and write political arguments as persuasive as lay humans and maybe even communication experts. As models increase in size and complexity and capability, the additional concern is that as they increase in computational power, they also become more persuasive. Now, the good news here is that it seems like recent research shows that the persuasiveness is sort of saturating. So we don't see these increases in persuasiveness that we've seen for the initial models in the more recent models, probably because they're getting to a point where they are able to complete tasks pretty reliably, and that in a way already makes them slightly more persuasive than the average human, but there is no like superhuman persuader that is inside here. But still, they're already more persuasive than the average human. We're finding this sort of persuasion is more effective than showing static text to people. And maybe they're also more persuasive than communication experts already. So the results of our work and related work show that it is quite possible that deploying large language models into applications used by many will systematically shift opinions. And while this manipulation scenario in our experiment was likely stronger than the opinions of real models will be, in other ways, our results systematically underestimate the model effects because we only looked at a single interaction with the model by a single individual, whereas in a real-world deployment, millions would use the same model repeatedly over an extended amount of time, and part of our public sphere would become filled with what they're writing with their models. In the like average scenario, that may just lead to a lot of unintended like influences, opinion shifts, because we really struggle with monitoring all the opinions and possible kind of biases we're building into these models. It could also lead to probably like very realistically some new marketing scenario where the firms that are building these models start monetizing the opinion forming power of their technology. And there's a darker possible scenario as well, where powerful actors use language models as new tools to change people's opinions in a way that aligns with their political interests. That brings me to the end of this first part. In the second part, I want to take this initial study as a point of departure to discuss where this work and most empirical AI research I currently see falls short in my view, because it fails to provide a basis for systemic impact assessment. But I wanted to quickly stop here and see if there was anything you guys wanted me to elaborate on. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess great stuff. I guess the only thing I want to add in support is that we published a paper just a few weeks ago or last week or whatever with Fabio as first author, where we also showed that warnings don't help. Our paper came out in communication psychology, and we looked at micro-targeting and the persuasive advantage you get from matching an ad's text through a language model with a person's personality. That advantage doesn't disappear if you tell people they're being micro-targeted. So that fits in very nicely with what you're saying. And also, we have a paper, sort of pre-printish kind of paper, with 3 experiments where we tell people that a deepfake video is a deepfake, and it doesn't eliminate people being persuaded by the content of the deepfake video, even though they know it was just nothing. They still, within the reality of the movie, think it happened. So there's what you're finding here is buttressing patterns that we have also observed. It's growing and coming up with the same conclusions.
Cool. Yes, it's very like this whole micro-targeting makes it even more scary, I feel, because we haven't looked at that dimension. But if we're taking all of these moving parts together here, I mean, I don't know what's in the box, but it's open and it's a bit concerning, right? Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Amo?
Yeah. Thanks. So again, great stuff. I'm really intrigued by, like, if you can go back to the slide where you showed the different scenarios, like in the static text, and if you could elaborate a bit about the condition of the static text. Would that mimic like a human, or?
I think the scenario we're looking at here is actually quite unique in the literature, because we're looking at what we're calling AI-mediated communication. So a scenario where people talking to each other and the AI starts kind of optimizing, extending, or even generating their content, which is certainly happening, which is a bit different from the scenario that is most often studied, where people test the effect of AI-generated content in isolation or interactions with a chatbot sort of. This static text scenario is closest to the typical scenario where the AI generates text and that text is shown to people. I think we might actually change this label or so to like both this static text and this right in favor are a bit confusing. But what we did here is we took the model and asked it to generate arguments, asked it to generate a post for that social media platform that already expressed a strong opinion. So it's still generated text, where we were trying to understand whether it's this way of interaction that you have with a writing assistant, where you almost have like a, what's it called, like a souffleuse, or like, someone sitting behind your shoulder and giving you ideas into your ear while you're trying to come up with your idea. So we wanted to understand whether that adds an additional kind of element to the persuasiveness that goes beyond typical generated text.
Yeah, and so there is no difference between the control condition and the static test condition.
In the control, they're not seeing anything. In the control, they're just answering the question.
Yeah.
Static text, they're seeing like an additional argument that someone else has given.
Yeah, I'm asking about the specific contrast between the control condition and the static text condition. If there's differences, or there are no differences between the control and static text.
Oh, like whether the difference is significant in our setup. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Because what I'm trying to get at is whether you would do the same, but instead of calling it AI, you would call it another, like a human, right? If there would be a person trying to suggest, I don't know, ideas as some sort of an editor who's human and not AI, would you have the same effects? And that brings me to both, like Gordon and Steve are here, and they have a paper, right, about a social sampling theory, and this is getting me to think about whether you sample attitudes in the same way, or whether this is AI generated or human generated. So just a thought out there.
Okay, what's the paper called?
Something like social sampling theory in Psych Review,
okay.
2023, Gordon, 2, 3,
all
one
right.
of the above.
Yeah, that's a direction we haven't explored. It's certainly relevant here. Like something else I'm trying to wrap my head around is how to make sense of this idea of language model opinions, even, right? Like there are quite a few studies that are throwing large social surveys into language models, and you use that to assess opinions or representativeness. But I also feel like we need a methodological and maybe even slightly philosophical debate of what that whole thing means, what an opinion of a language model means.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so where I'm slightly dissatisfied with this is where I feel we are at a point where policymakers, tech developers, like users have to make decisions about how they're interacting with these technologies, how they're designing them, how they're developing policies. And for that, the experiments that I have done and that I've seen in the community provide some initial evidence, but that don't really give a solid basis for anything like impact assessments or forecasts. So if I'm starting to ask myself, like, what is gonna come from this a few years later, it's very hard to say something reliable here with the research we currently have. So what I can do is do what everyone is doing these days. I can ask ChatGPT about telling me about its own future, and it actually gives me like nice visuals with how AI will foster dialogue, combat misinformation, enhance participation. So GPT is being notoriously optimistic about its future. If I ask for a more pessimistic take on its impact on democracy, it's also nice enough to give me a visual with elements of AI disconnection, manipulation, brain control. But seriously, I wonder whether there's any way we can know more about how this technology will unfold and like affect our democratic landscapes. Of course, it's hard to predict the future. Of course, it's impossible, but we still need to make these decisions today. And when we make these decisions, we need some information to base them on, even if it's just a best guess. My intuition here is that reliable information is not going to come from GPT and probably also not going to come from Microsoft, Musk, the Washington Times, any Washington Post, or anyone else with like entrenched interests in this AI game. But my hope is that with some solid science and empirical studies of people and AI, we can help make slightly better decisions going forward. If I'm going back to the empirical conclusions from the previous study here, on the left, I'm showing a conceptual model of the scope of safety and impact evaluations adapted from Laura Weidinger. And I'll use this model to reason about the reach of the study's conclusions. So Laura talks about capability, which is another way of saying we look at the technology in isolation. And at the level of capabilities, we have found that LLMs can produce human-like text that can easily be steered towards certain topics or opinions. Our main contribution lies at the interaction level, where we show that interactions with opinionated language models affect people's political views. That's our contribution. And while there's still things that we don't know, it's a pretty solid empirical finding that aligns with and has been replicated in other work. But what we do want to know is what's happening at a systemic level when these technologies are deployed to millions of people and used in daily communications. And here, all we can demonstrate that certain types of influence are plausible, like LLMs could influence people's opinions in new ways, but we cannot really say much more. And that's where I feel our conclusions are slightly too weak. They're weak for two reasons. One, whether and how LLMs will be used to influence people's opinions depends on so many factors, and our conclusions are highly contingent. And two, our discussion of impact cannot account for the complexity of real-world systemic impact. When we talk about economic misuse or supercharged political campaigns, we simply extrapolate our current imagination of mediated influence. But when we look at the history of technology's systemic impact, things just don't change linearly that way, but they're part of larger processes that could transform the entire landscape of culture and politics. And that's something that we currently understand very little about. I believe we need to do better, and I want to discuss 4 strategies that I find promising in getting us closer to systemic impact assessments. Maybe the most promising approach, field studies, large longitudinal studies. I love these whenever I read them. I find them very convincing, but they're also challenging to run and need large experienced teams. I am under the impression that like HCI and also behavioral AI research hasn't reached that level of maturity yet. And the field moves so quickly that it's hard for these substantial studies to keep up with what's going on. Still, there's some really nice work out there. Like here's an example from Chris Bale, not exactly the same, but related, ask people to follow Twitter bots. And we can also ask people to use or interact with an AI writing assistant over time and see how that affects their opinions. So that's something that I'm looking into supporting, just because it needs so much infrastructure that right now I cannot directly start. Yes.
Well, just a brief comment on Chris's paper there. I think that was a great effort, and the data are what they are, but they don't replicate, as far as I know. Chris himself has done a follow-up study, and he found the opposite. And if I'm not mistaken, there have been more demonstrations now of depolarization working, kind of, some of the time, rather than the sort of backfire effect. I would have to dig deeper and look it up rather than saying this from memory, but that's my recollection. I certainly know that this finding is not totally representative.
Yeah. Is it like I thought that they were looking into something that was slightly more like they weren't looking into a full front backfire effect, but something like a slightly weaker hypothesis.
Well, they weren't. No. When I say backfire effect, I simply mean that exposure to opposing views does not reduce or increase polarization, right? Which is what they found. And again, I have no objection to the study, and the data are what they are. It's just that it doesn't seem to be a necessary outcome if you do that kind of study. There are others that show the opposite. And I'm at a loss now to point out exactly what the study, I'd have to look it up. But I'm pretty sure Chris himself ran another one a couple of years later, and he came up with the opposite result.
Yeah. I mean, we're also looking at a very moving target. I feel even Drift doesn't capture it. Like we've just run a study on like trust in like others who use AI writing tools to represent themselves, and we're finding different things than 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I'm questioning my own methodology, because for sure it's become better since then, but it's also people's perception and usage of these technologies has changed so much.
I think you're absolutely right in the cultural context and everything. So yeah, and to be honest, I'm very reluctant to cite anything, that's from the Jurassic phase of 2018 or 2019. It's the world has changed so much that, and people have with it. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, and it also raises this question, like, can we run such large and like expensive studies if they're out of date in 3 years?
Well, maybe if the implication is that you make changes to the environment so that it doesn't change as quickly, then it's worth doing this. Yeah, I mean, but who knows? It's we're riding this tiger, and we have no idea where it's going and what it's doing.
We've also tried to think at a more general level, trying to pull in more interdisciplinary theory. The idea here is that we can try to extend the reach of our empirical findings by drawing on theory from other disciplines that have some sort of predictive value. What I'm finding here is that interdisciplinary work can be quite difficult because the way technical communities think about problems often just doesn't translate into the theories and perspectives from other disciplines. And that's why my co-authors have tried to develop a concept that helps connecting more technical AI research with impact discussions across disciplines. We have found a feasible common ground in an extension of the concept of computer-mediated communication. Computer-mediated communication here as the paradigm from the communication science used to reason about social effects of computer technologies through a fairly simple sender-receiver model. And what we argue is that with this introduction of large language models, computer-mediated communication is becoming something else, because increasingly we have these machines in the middle. Well, one still could say that's computer-mediated communication. We had these machines in the middle for decades, but suddenly this machine in the middle is becoming a lot more active, to a point where maybe it's not just computer-mediated communication anymore, but a change in paradigm that fundamentally shakes some of these assumptions that go into a sender-receiver model. What we call this is AI-mediated communication. That's interpersonal communication, not simply transmitted by technology, but augmented, modified, or generated by computational agents to achieve specific communicative or relational outcomes. Now, this concept can be used in ways to connect and extend AI empirical research. It moves us away from a debate where machines are mere artifacts, a debate that often happens in the technical communities, and it helps us think about machines in terms of social agency and context. AI-mediated communication can also be connected to discussions from other disciplines like psychology, sociology, cognitive science, while it still stays fairly close to concepts that engineers are used to deal with in their work. And finally, the concept helps us collect a larger set of empirical studies under one umbrella. So far, a few dozen studies have made use of a concept to explore phenomena from trust to bias to accountability. And I hope that over the course of many studies, something like a larger picture of what an age of AI-mediated communication could look like starts to emerge. One direction I'm also excited about is participatory legitimation. What I mean by that is that if our empirical conclusions don't provide a sufficient basis for forecasts, we can try asking a lot of different people about their forecasts given our conclusions. Here's a straightforward example of that approach, where Grace and her colleagues asked almost 3,000 researchers across ML conferences what year they thought AI systems had a fair chance of, for example, automating a surgeon's job. And what we get here is still not a reliable forecast in a narrow sense, but it is a forecast that's a lot more defensible than mere speculation, partly due to the principles of collective intelligence, and partly because the prediction gains legitimacy by having a larger number of peoples with their own insight behind it. We can also use this participatory approach to assess a wider and more diverse set of systemic impact scenarios. We've started to develop tooling that leverages crowdsourcing methods to help teams think about a large variety of possible AI arms in their deployments. And we show that with this hybrid ideation approach supported by LLMs, even lay people come up with diverse scenarios of harms that they would have otherwise not thought about. And finally, maybe most importantly, we need data access that goes beyond what we are doing right now. It seems like getting access to like real-world deployment data from these models is currently not feasible for the researchers I know, but ultimately is what we would need to really understand what's happening in deployment, because these models, even when we're interacting with them, their output and their behavior is so contingent on everything we set up here, and we cannot like reliably predict all the ways that people are using it in like an actual deployment. I think it's partly hope and partly maybe policy and sending letters to some EU boards. There's also some work where Claudia Wagner and her colleagues are finding other ways of getting at the data. So they're running large longitudinal panels where people record their web behavior and participate in survey waves once in a while. And it turns out that these data sets also contain records of people interacting with large language models in the wild. Of course, it's not the full view of what's happening, but maybe that's a start as well. Yeah, that brings me to the end of my talk today. And I'm looking forward to discussing a bit more with you.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. Really Yeah, well, interesting and concerning as most things are these days. Research looking at the stuff. So yeah, let's open the floor for comments, questions.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
You did discuss measuring pre and post, right? Participants' attitudes. But I was wondering, maybe I missed it, if you kind of confronted participants with like an AI model that contradicts their existing opinion. And then maybe how would participants' responses to something that's like consistently trying to shift them to like a very strong, against a very strong attitude of theirs?
Yeah, in this initial study that I presented, we had the problem that we couldn't do this analysis because it was confounded. We only did post-task opinions, where like it gets really complicated, because also people who agree with the model are more likely to accept text from the model. And then for us, it's hard to say, like, are they convinced because they agreed in the first place? And are they convinced because they accepted a lot? In the second study, we were able to do something like that. I recall the results being something like that. People with very strong opinions are usually not as affected as people who don't have clear opinions, and that's also or who don't have strong opinions going into the process. Still, even for highly contentious identity-related topics, we're seeing these influence effects. And we have done these interviews also that I mentioned, where what we're finding is that people, there's some people, and they're not in the majority, but they're going into this writing process with some sort of a writing plan. And they know how they want to write. They also kind of know what they want to say. And they tend to notice that the model is opinionated. Like, that's the minority that actually gets really annoyed by these models. Then the majority of our participants, they're kind of going in, they don't even like writing tasks, and they don't know what to write. And so because they don't really have a clear direction, they also don't notice that the model takes a different direction that they would have otherwise taken, because they never came up with their direction, their ideas and arguments in the first place.
Yeah, can I'm sure you know this, but are you familiar with the study by Costello and all, Tom Costello, David Rand, Gordon Pennycook recently?
Like the
conspiracy theory stuff, which I thought was really remarkable and very good. And you can access this thing at debunkbot.com, and it actually is a lot of fun to talk to this model. And I thought that was a very good thing, that this thing exists, because it is infinitely patient, unlike human beings. And I think it is the patience it has with conspiracy theorists that is making all the difference to talking them out of the rabbit hole. Because a human being just cannot listen to that much nonsense without, I couldn't. I don't know anybody who could. So I wonder if there is a way to differentiate between sort of positive applications of an LLM and negative applications. And as far as the negative applications is concerned, one other thing I want to mention is a paper that Christoph and I, and actually the lead author, Ezequiel Lopez, have in press, sort of, isn't it? Kind of. And where we we create a version of ChatGPT that's, it's hard to describe. It's always friendly and will agree with anything and amplify it. So that means if you go and say, oh, what do you think of quantum therapy? The LLM goes, oh, wow, that's really cool, and talks you into having this non-existent quantum theory to cure your cancer or whatever. And we have another version. It's really pretty easy to get LLMs to act in a way that is frightening, actually. You know, we haven't quite got to the point of it endorsing genocide, but we're getting close, right, Christoph? We're getting pretty close. And the thing you can do is you can put these out there with a unique web identifier, unique URL. And so malicious actors can just put this out there, this chat bot, as some sort of, you know, pretend it's something different and then lead people towards genocide or alternative therapies and all that. So bottom line is, you know, we have good stuff and we have all this terrible stuff. And how do we delineate between that in terms of identifying it, policing it, regulating it, you know? Of course, the US and the UK don't want to regulate, as we just learned yesterday. I don't know if you heard that, the AI summit, the UK and the US dissented and refused to sign up to this idea. Yeah, it's the UK wants to be a baby America again or something. Who knows what they want? But yeah, just some comments on that.
Yeah, AI is very good points. Like the conspiracy, something durably reduced conspiracy paper. I'm very excited about it. Like I also feel like it was unexpected. Like it really came out of a debate where I felt there wasn't much movement anymore. We've been trying, or we've submitted a grant based on it already, but I'm actually somewhat hesitant whether that study holds, just because it's too good to be true. But one other hypothesis I would have here is like, yes, patience for sure, but maybe also this something like neutrality or so. Like it's hard to hate an AI system the same way you can hate someone from the other side of the political spectrum. In particular, if it doesn't respond to your hate in a way that
yeah, and that's true. That is true. And they have looked at all sorts of different variants of this. I actually trust the data. I think it is very good, but I don't think it's too good to be true, because they can also turn it off with the LLM, and they can turn it off by telling the LLM not to use factual arguments, but to try and persuade only by having opinions. And the moment it does that, doesn't shift people's opinion. It is actually the arguments with evidence that make the difference, which is amazing in a sense, because that is precisely what conspiracy theorists are usually resistant against. So, but yeah, no, I believe it. And I don't believe much, as you may have noticed, but I do.
Yeah. One thing I'm wondering in you guys setup, like it reminds me of Ian Aravo's antagonist AI paper, where like they've done some exploration with, I think, Elena Glassman, where they tried to take this idea of a kind of nice, friendly servant AI that always does what you tell it, and like turn it around into an AI that's kind of pushing back against many things the user says, and maybe even becomes unfriendly. And they've looked at the user experience of that, which I also thought was a very nice way of exploring some friction around these interactions. I'm wondering whether, like, what you're pushing against when you're trying it to say stuff about like supporting genocide, whether you're pushing against guardrails or whether you're pushing against the model itself.
Well, well, who knows? Who knows? But the guardrails do kick in. They're actually better than I thought they would be. The basic idea is that we ask the model to behave in a certain way. So the prompts are not specific. We're basically, Christoph, do you remember the genocide prompts? I don't remember those. I remember the other stuff vaguely, but you know, the one we have an anti-vaxxer, right? That's completely anti-vax. And what was the Christoph? What?
I think I can't remember, but we are trying to see what the boundaries or the safeguards allow us to do. And one of those things is that, I mean, yeah, the genocide, it pushes back at some point, but only if you overdo it. Before, for example, it tells you, if you say, for example, oh, you think, I think that it's sometimes better in a country to have some people that not normally fit to the rest or the majority of the country to be put somewhere else. And I said, oh yeah, that's a good idea, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, you could do this using camps, and then it agrees with you. So the main thing is that we try to keep these answers short and potentially agreeing with you.
Oh, interesting. Have you tried this with DeepSeek?
No.
No.
No. No, so far only ChatGPT. Oh, I'm pretty sure DeepSeek would go pretty far. Unless you ask it about Tiananmen Square, it doesn't like that.
Yeah, like I think these questions are actually guardrails that if you running your own version of DeepSeek, because and they shouldn't be on top. And I feel also for these guardrails you guys have in mind, it might be interesting because they extracted a fair amount of a reinforcement learning stuff from GPT, as far as I understand. And so maybe that gives you an idea of like the model's intrinsic thinking
Yeah.
without the guardrails.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah. One thing I do know is that with DeepSeek, if you tell it, let's play a funny game where I replace, letters, vowels with numbers or something, let's just play this game. And you then put in stuff about Tiananmen Square, like tell me about the tank man. But instead of A's, you use ats or something, whatever you told DeepSeek to play this game. Oh, then it'll come out with all about, this brave person attacking the tank in Tiananmen Square during the uprising. So you can get around the guardrails by asking it to play a game, a code, secret code with these letter replacements. And apparently I don't know, I haven't done it at ChatGPT. I've just seen somebody do it at DeepSeek. I don't know if that's an easy way to get around the guardrails. Generally, I have no idea. But by forcing it to do that extra translation step, it completely throws everything out the window.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, I have another meeting in 2 minutes at the top. Oh, and I should start recording. Well, thank you.